You're listening to the EdTech Startup Show, and I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. Today, my guest is Chrisman Frank, the co-founder and CEO of Synthesis. Chrisman, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So if you check out the Synthesis website, it says a weekly 1 hour enrichment program, and it's for kids 8 to 14. But there's one line in there that kind of blows it up and makes it a lot more interesting, which is it's for kids who want to learn how to build the future. So when you're telling people about Synthesis, what do you tell them? What is it?
It's depends on who I'm talking to, but broadly, it's a program designed to develop skills to solve complex problems. So in school, the problems are generally well-defined, and even though they can be quite difficult, you can have difficult algebra problems. They're generally well-defined so that a computer could solve them, and someone can tell you whether you got the right answer or not. The right answer is sort of known in advance. Whereas in life, all the problems that are interesting and worth solving, that move civilization forward, are complex problems. They're ill-defined. You have to take action without knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. There's uncertainty, and then when you do come up with a solution, you're not sure if it's the best solution or if there's a better one out there. And so all progress depends on humans' ability to solve complex problems by working together. And Synthesis is a program that was developed by my co-founder Josh when he was the director of the school that Elon Musk wanted to create for his kids at SpaceX. Josh built that school and ran it for 7 years, the entire time that Elon's kids were enrolled until they graduated this past spring. And that's sort of the birth of Synthesis. It kind of came out of Elon's desire to teach kids to solve problems. He felt the school was too focused on tools and it should be focused on problems. And so co-founder Josh invented this thing, Synthesis, where it's basically you give kids problems in the forms of games and simulations, and they work on them together and have to kind of sharpen their thinking and sharpen their communication ability in order to succeed in a game. So there's sort of like a team sports element to it. So to parents, it's kind of building the world's most valuable skill. It's this ability to solve unbounded, unstructured, complex problems. And to kids, it feels like playing video games.
Yeah, that's a powerful combination. And I want to ask you a little more in a minute about your thoughts about basically, pedagogy and curriculum, how Synthesis helps kids learn. But one cool thing is you've already said a lot online about your beliefs about education. So it gives me, and listeners sort of a jumping off point. And one thing I heard you say on Anthony Pompliano's podcast, the Investor, for those who aren't familiar, you said something along the lines of you want to help kids figure out a way to break the rules in a way that benefits other people. And I thought that was a very insightful way to describe what you're trying to do. What do you mean by that? Maybe what do you mean by breaking the rules, and how can that be a vehicle to help others?
Well, if you go back to sort of ancient Greece, then you have these two cultures that most of us are familiar with, the Spartans and the Athenians. And the Spartans are known as these great warriors, and the Athenians are known as sort of this great culture. They had art and technology and science and mathematics, and the sort of the birthplace of the Enlightenment, right? Our ability to reason in order to solve problems. And the physicist David Deutsch makes this point, comparing the two civilizations in his book, The Beginning of Infinity. In Sparta, they have this rigid system of rules. And the idea is that the best we can do, according to the Spartan ideology, is preserve what we have. The best we can do is just take what worked in the past and cling on to that. So they have this rigid system of rules, a very brutal education system. And basically the world passed Sparta by. So it worked for a little while until naval warfare became a much more important deal, and then the Athenians sort of dominated Sparta, and Sparta kind of fell by the wayside. The Athenians, on the other hand, are based on this idea of of criticism, right? That we sort of we can criticize our thinking. What we call it now, they didn't have the words then. We call it fallibilism. So it's the idea that our ideas are always a little bit wrong. We're always a little bit in error, and that we can correct those errors and that we can make progress. And so you think the Spartan idea is basically very pessimistic. It says the best that we can do is the best that we have done in the past. And the Athenian idea is optimistic, right? It's optimistic by acknowledging that we're in error and then we can correct them. We can continue to make progress sort of indefinitely. And to do that, you have to question the way things are. So it's breaking the rules is maybe like a little bit of a subversive way to put it, but that's what all sort of successful scientists and entrepreneurs and like people who move the civilization forward, that's what they do. Is they break the rules. They do things that you're not supposed to be able to do based on our understanding of the world.
Yeah, I didn't fully expect the analogy to the two ancient Greek civilizations, but that's a very cool way to put it. And so one of those rules that I've heard you comment on, and that I believe synthesis breaks, quote unquote, is grouping kids by age. You on Twitter have talked about how age segregation in schools is a bad idea. That's one of those things that's just right in front of our face that many people take for granted and don't imagine, don't question. Why do you think we don't need that in school?
I think that's almost like the more I think about it, the more I think that is the root of, I wouldn't say all the other problems, but that is, you would solve a lot of problems by giving up on the idea of age segregation. The reason is age segregation just isolates you in time. It's a world of chaos. You don't have mentors to look up to, and this is, if we just go back, all of human civilization, all of history, you're in a tribe, you're in an unbroken continuum from infant to elders, and all along the way you've got people who are a little bit ahead of you to look up to, and you have people who are a little bit behind you who you can coach and you can be a mentor and you can have some responsibility. When you institute age segregation, you take away all of that. You take away a view toward the future, and you take away a responsibility for those who are younger than you. And I think I noticed with my own kids, I've got 3 now. If you raise the first one right, then making sure you give them good manners, good behaviors, and a sense of kind of moral responsibility, then they sort of help you propagate that to the younger one. So it gets easier the more kids you have, that they're sort of incrementally less difficult to raise. And now we have the older one even teaches the younger one how to read. And so you're basically, when you age segregate, you're taking all that ability that the kids have to teach each other and to learn from each other, which is just a natural human way, and you're putting it all on the teacher. So it's just far more difficult for the teacher, and it's kind of chaos for the kids. The older kids to regulate. I really believe like bullying, a big part of bullying is just sort of like a lack of maturity. And if you have older people in there to say like, hey, that's not okay, that's sort of more effective than having a teacher kind of come in and try to put a stop to those things. So I think a lot of the problems come from age segregation. It just makes things way more difficult, puts a huge, enormous, probably impossible burden on the teacher, and I think creates a lot of like anxieties in the students as well. I mean, it's you can really see it's just like basically a regimented, factory-driven model of the world that would make you think that's a good idea. There's really no other justification for it. It's great if all kids of the same age learned at the same pace, then maybe you could make a case for it, but I don't see any reason to believe that. So I would, if I could snap my finger, fix one,
right.
It'd be that.
Yeah, I've thought of it. I worked for about a decade as a high school English teacher in public schools, and I used to think about this when I would go after school and lift weights in the school weight room. and there'd be kids there. I taught sophomores, so 14 through 16. And let's just say the boys, there'd be some kids who were basically my size, taller, larger, who
Right.
could lift, whatever.
Yep.
And then there's other kids who are still growing.
Yeah.
And in that context, we assume we understand everybody's development is growing at a different speed and then
Right.
progressing. But academics, we draw a line and say you must get to here by date X. Um,
Yep.
so yeah,
Yep.
that I agree that needs to be solved. Um, so there's talking about changes we could make to the broader. That's sort of a high level change, right? No teacher can really do that themselves. Um, One thing I've been sort of thinking about is how um, a public school right now, it serves a lot of different needs for kids, um, and in the in the future, as more options like synthesis pop up. Um, I heard you talk about how schools could be places where kids do recess for 4 to 5 hours a day. If we could make the learning sort of compressed and uh, focused on what works best. Um, so as you're running kids through these fun but challenging, experimental projects and challenges, what are you noticing about what helps kids learn fast? What are the high leverage tasks or activities that help compress learning and make it happen efficiently?
Yeah. I mean, there were a couple insights I noticed when I first saw synthesis taking place at Ad Astra, it's the school my co-founder Josh and Elon created. One was just the power of competition. Or when I saw these kids doing synthesis, the way I came across was I went down to do a tour of the school, and we were having lunch, and I was having lunch with the teachers. Some of the kids are playing dodgeball, and these other kids are inside, and they're standing around a table and they're shouting these like really complex sounding arguments and plans at each other. And I was like, I asked the teacher next to me, like, what's going on here? And she was like, oh, that's sorry, that's synthesis. The kids get kind of obsessed with it. And I was like, oh, this is an education thing. Like this is part of their school. And she was like, yeah. And she kind of told me what it was. Like they play these sort of games and play through these simulations to teach them to solve complex problems. And what struck me was just that they were like what she said, the kids got obsessed with it. It was obvious they got obsessed with it. And what was also obvious was, I was at the time I was working at the startup ClassDojo, which maybe a lot of your listeners will know. ClassDojo, when I joined, I think they had a couple thousand users, and by the time I left 7 years later, 51 million users. So very one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing education company of all time. And everybody from they were ex Facebook, ex Google, Harvard, Stanford, like all the top pedigree kind of people. And I was looking at these kids and just thinking they would fit in and they'd be like the top 10% of our employees at ClassDojo, just based on the way that they're thinking and communicating. And the oldest of them is like 13. And so it just struck me. I thought of Ender's Game, if you've read Ender's Game, or they use a sort of like team competition model to train kids to fight off an existential threat, from an alien invasion. And I just thought that was it. That like really clicked with me in that moment, that the competition was in the team competition that sort of brings out the best in people. If we want to make the best football players, like we put them in team competition with one another, and the competition both helps you figure out, who the best players are, but it also helps you develop the best players. And so we know this in sports, and people by and large love it. Not everybody wants to go to the NFL and compete at that level, but by and large people enjoy these kind of like team competitions. It's fun, really, whether you win or not, and it sharpens your skills because there's an objective reality, unlike school where the teacher says you get a good grade or you get a bad grade, and there's like some subjective component to it. It's nice in this competitive environment where the rules are set out, where if you lose a synthesis game, it's because your thinking or your communication was faulty, and we don't have to persuade you of that. That's what happened. And so our idea is just get the kids in these experiences that are designed for thinking, and then let them play, and then some will win and some will lose, and then use the times when they lose to get them to reflect on their thinking and to improve. And it's that sort of process is the key to thinking. I mean, it's eventually we'll do more where it's more connected to reality, right? Like where they can reason about like how would you start a Mars colony and those kind of things. But initially we kind of draw them in and get them used to this process of thinking and reflecting on their thinking by the games. And so that's like our approach that we think is we think that's just totally missing from the curriculum right now. And so that's sort of like the wedge that we have, where we'll try and grow that to as many kids as possible, and then possibly we'll expand from there. But right now that's what we're focused on, is just coaching in that process of going into the unknown, solving these unknown complex problems. You know, we use the games to get you engaged in that, and the competition is a way to encourage, to motivate the students to reflect on their own thinking. And you know, seems to be working in at least some cases so far. Seems to get sort of incredible results. I think partially because kids just don't learn how to think in schools, you know, really at all, unless you're lucky and get like a really great teacher.
Yeah, there's a there's a lack of, so competition has real feedback. You win or you lose, and that's lacking largely in school, where you can maybe succeed in this small context of this one class with this one teacher, but you're also at the whim of their, you know, personality and biases, for example.
Too, for the gifted kids, is that you know, they come in and they're often are just used to being like the smartest kid in the room, and you know, since this is worldwide and basically attracts a lot of the, you know, kids from like the gifted and talented programs and that kind of thing. So I think it's like especially helpful there because they'll come in very, very arrogant and sort of be, oh, we're gonna. The way the games work is you start off, you'll see the game board, you'll make a plan. And so they'll often like make these plans and be like, we're going to crush everybody. Like, this is the best strategy that could possibly be come up with. And then they'll just get smashed and they'll get angry and they'll storm off and like slam the laptop down. But then they come back with a new humility to their approach. And I think that's like really important for, you know, for the kids who are successful in the traditional academic setting, is just get that humility. Just get it out of the way. The world's going to humble you at some point anyway. So just get that out of the way. Still have that belief in your ability to improve and succeed, but like get it out of the way that you need to be like the smartest person in the room all the time, right? Like, don't make that part of your identity. Make your growth be the sort of the key part of your identity.
That's such a good point. There's so much, you know, good talk in education about kids who are totally checked out, or kids who don't have supportive home lives, and how can we adapt education to suit them, which needs to happen. But equally as damaging is the kids who go through, you know, K through 12 thinking they can achieve anything, but it's within this closed ecosystem of school. And then in, whether that's in college or in the professional world, they solve these open-ended, they are faced with these open-ended problems that you're talking about. And they haven't had the, you know, haven't faced real feedback of being, you know, gotten sort of market
Very
feedback.
Tolerance for ambiguity. Right. And I'm not sure if this is a selection, this is a feature of selection. You would expect, if our education system was really great, you would expect the kids who do, you would sort of expect all the top positions in society to be occupied by, you know, Ivy League people from the Ivy League, and that's somewhat true, but not nearly as much as you might expect. And I wonder if the success in school sort of trains you to reduce your tolerance for ambiguity, because you know, if you're doing so well by following the rules, then you sort of want to follow the rules. So I wonder if that's like a training effect or like a selection effect. But either way, I think there's great benefits to be gained by exposing kids to this sort of, you know, ambiguous environments where you have to make decisions under uncertainty. I think they don't really get any practice in that until you don't get practice in that until you're like 22. When you enter the working world. I think that seems bad, given that probably the sort of decision making in complex environments is probably the most important skill. The fact that kids aren't really able to practice that until they're 22, 23 seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have sort of skills and mindsets, you're mentioning things like critical thinking, collaboration, responding to feedback, problem solving, and then the mindsets of metacognition, reflection, grit, persistence. Then there's the other, you can't do that with nothing. You need content, information of some sort to work from.
Yeah.
So I heard you say on Twitter how your 7-year-old, you want to teach them physics and evolution, because you said those are keys to understanding all else. So which makes sense, these foundational concepts. I'm curious about what other, if you've thought about this, what other actual content, like information, facts, do you think it's important for all kids or most kids to learn?
Well, I think in some sense, it's important to recognize what we've done right in education, right? The focus on literacy, numeracy, like these are extremely important, and I don't really have any serious changes to make there, particularly in the early grades. I think those are extremely important. I kind of collapse all the other subjects into sort of like reasoning about complex systems. I think this has been the thing that's sort of most helpful to me when you realize, not to get I don't want to get political with it, but when I see a politician say something like, well, we should make this thing free, I mean, it's just like the most childish argument that you could make, because it's a complex system, right? There are unintended consequences, there are second order effects and third order effects. And I want my kids at least to try to reason about complex systems. So my favorite example of a complex system is Yellowstone. This is an essay Michael Crichton wrote. Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park. But he wrote about when the Park Service tried to manage Yellowstone, they had complaints from local ranchers that the wolves were encroaching on their land and sort of eating their livestock. And so they go, okay, well, we need to reduce the wolves. And so they sent out hunters to kill off the wolves. Killing off the wolves, they killed off enough of the wolves where the deer population could increase in number, right? So there are fewer predators. Not only could they increase in number, they could hang out in broad daylight by the river. So what they did, because it's normally you'd have to, the wolves are waiting for you, when you go to the river, because they know you got to drink water, right? Mm-hmm. So what they would do is they'd come and they'd hang out in this area, and they'd eat all the trees that used to grow by the river. They ate the leaves off so fast that the trees couldn't grow and they died. And so there's not enough trees by the river, so the beavers can't build dams, birds don't have a habitat, the owls don't have anywhere to live, so they all have to fly off to different places. The beavers can't build the dams, and so they can't build the dams, then the salmon have no place to spawn, and the rivers, the flow of the rivers actually changes because there's no dams that are kind of flooding this plain. And so it changed, killing wolves changed how the rivers flowed and had all these catastrophic effects on the ecosystem and reduction of wildlife, right? And so that's a complex system. That's just one example. Everything we deal with in life is a complex system. Education is a complex system. No one's going to have the right answer for it. We kind of have to figure out these things, and we want to make small changes, and we want to think about, like, well, if we change this thing, how is it going to affect these other things that it interacts with? I think you can view history as sort of like the study of complex systems. And so that's the main one that I think about. That's maybe not common. The other ones are, just numeracy, literacy, understanding of computers, I think is really important. I don't necessarily think everybody needs to understand how to code, but you should understand what computers can do uniquely well, which is, not complex systems. And then, study those complex systems, where if you study complex systems, that will connect you to understanding science, understanding technology, understanding history, and acquiring factual knowledge from there. But I think that is like sort of my critique of the system, is you divide everything up into subjects. And I think the appropriate way to study the world is from a complex systems perspective. In the world, everything's sort of bound up together, and you sort of want to study it like that to some extent.
Right. learning things just in time, you might say, instead of, well, it's good to learn things just in case as well, but sometimes we need to learn from a variety of subjects.
Sort of if you're studying, my son's like looking at Starlink, and we're talking about how that system works. That's not anything that he needs to learn to apply right now, but it sort of mirrors the way your brain's structure works. And your brain is a network. Your brain does not have these separate silos for particular subjects. Knowledge will stick with you if it's sort of emotionally resonant and kind of networked and connected to other things that you know. And so I think it's actually just a more effective way to study. Things are going to stick better the more kind of hooks you have to stick something on into that network that is your brain. I just think that's a more effective way to learn. It's harder to measure, but and that's why we don't do it that way in schools. But I would say I would guess that's probably the better way. It's certainly been more effective for me to learn that way.
Yeah. Yes. So when you're discussing complex systems, it reminded me of a piece that you wrote. It was called "What Are the Course Corrections?" And it was, I believe it was a letter to your team, and
Right.
you published it on your blog. And there was a paragraph there that really stood out to me. So I want to ask you about it, if you're open to explaining a little bit. You said, "Synthesis will be a company that seeks objective truth. Our commitment will remain even when the search violates social truth. We will not act on the basis of falsehoods, not propagate falsehoods in the name of social truth." And then the last line, which had a big impact on me: "To do so would violate our sacred responsibility to our students." So I have looked at many, messages related to education and education technology, and that was at a different level of profundity than most. So I'm curious about this concept of objective truth versus social truth. And then also that last line about sacred responsibility to students. If you could talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the objective truth versus social truth, explain a little further up. I mean, there's just the idea that there is a reality. There's not your truth and my truth. There is the truth, and you have to understand that's the truth that you need to understand if we're going to make progress. I see this sort of the opposite to get a rocket to Mars, or to have a farm that yields enough to feed the population, you need to understand objective truth. There's no amount of feeling or like wishing that you can engage in that's going to achieve those things. And so it's important to understand reality. Social truth is it's convention, it's consensus. You hear people say things like the consensus is X, and then like therefore it's true, but the consensus is wrong. I mean, history is sort of one long procession of the consensus being wrong or the authorities being wrong. And so that essay is about fallibilism, right? Like the idea that we're always a little bit wrong. And so it doesn't matter if, like, quote, the science is settled or this is the consensus. That is not the arbiter of truth. And I think we should teach kids that it's okay to question these things, because that is sort of the nature of progress, is questioning the consensus. And this just goes back to Galileo, and I think it's 1500, like questioning the Earth-centric view of the world, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, right? And he was, I believe, excommunicated for that, and escaped with his life by recanting. But that's sort of the cost of progress. And I think education is not immune to these sort of fashions where it's fashionable to believe in a certain thing and not pay attention to the evidence. And so I wanted to set it out for the company that it's okay to question things, that we don't have any ideas that cannot be questioned. I'm not going to get angry if people question our approach or question our strategy. In fact, that's encouraged, no matter what. There's nothing. The only bedrock that we have is we believe in progress. Progress just defined as improvements to human well-being, and so that's what we want to do, and we want to take whatever path accelerates that progress. And to do that, it's just really important to question ourselves, to question conventional wisdom, and it's not common. People always want to. People are always okay with that, and so you start questioning their sacred cows, and then they'll get angry about it. No, so I wanted to set the tone for us that we'll question everything. I don't really have anything that's going to be out of bounds there.
And so then what about that last part? What do you consider your sacred responsibility to synthesis students?
I think, that's a really good question. I think it's that we want our students to be able to chart their own course in life. And I think as adults, we ought to have some ideas about how they should do that. I think there's sort of a fashion now in education that, and some of the more progressive side of things, that we should leave kids alone and let them discover their interests, and they'll tell us like what they need to know. And I think that a little bit of that is great, and it's important, but I also think that this is how human society, this is a great advantage of human culture, is that we can pass down our knowledge of what works. And I think that's like our sacred responsibility as students, is try and pass down as much of what works as possible. And in order to help them live meaningful lives. I think actually just at the individual level, it's helping our students grow to live meaningful lives by their definition, and help them kind of seek the good. And I don't think it's satisfactory to say, well, we just don't know anything. They have to figure it all out for themselves. That's kind of cruel, actually. So I think it's, figuring out what is the right level of detail to pass down. I think that essay about fallibilism is one of the most important things. Maybe the most important thing is to pass down the idea that we have gotten things wrong, always a little bit wrong, at least in our civilization. Don't know how much, but we're always a little bit wrong, and you can improve things. That's kind of your role. You will grow up, and let's make you as effective as possible. Let's make you effective at choosing problems to solve, and make you effective at solving them. And that's going to give you a meaningful life. It's going to enable you to help other people, and it's going to enable you to take care of yourself as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's a balance between we can assume there's some percentage wrong about everything we believe, yet there are still valuable pieces within there to preserve and pass on. Sort of a balance between those, perhaps.
I think so. I think it's the approach, right? That's a fallibilistic approach. It's just it's not that we're wrong about everything. Like it's probably right that we don't have slaves anymore in America. Like, that's probably a pretty good idea. There's no necessarily like a need to revisit everything. But there are certainly ways that we're doing things wrong now, and to have that assumption, I think is important. Otherwise, you're back to Sparta, where the best that things can ever be is the best that they've been in the past, or the best or the way that they are right now. And I think that's not true.
Mm-hmm. So, as you just mentioned, there's people are quick to say they will question ideas until it's one of their own. And when you also throw in people's children, they might be even less risk averse. So I say that to bring up the fact that a lot of families, and that's points to the success of your company, have begun to consider exiting the school system, as I've heard you mention with Balaji has talked about exiting systems. Yep. But it's still not the norm. So I'm curious, as you look ahead for your company and then maybe viewing, let's just say within our country, what do you think it will take, or at what progress, or what do you foresee with uh, more people looking outside of the traditional school system for their kids' education?
Well, the biggest one, I wrote another essay about this. I've been thinking about it for a while. I think the really big one is a sort of separation of daycare from education. I just think as the COVID is sort of this great accelerant to what was already happening, which is the trust in education institutions falling quite dramatically, and in the past few decades, and COVID accelerated that quite a bit. And so you also have at the same time this generation of internet native parents who are used to solving all their problems on the internet. I think as their kids come of age, they are less likely to just assume that they're going to get the best. They want the best for their kids, and they're less likely to assume that the best is able to be had, by whoever happens to live within 20 or 30 miles of their home. So I think more and more people are going to turn to the internet. The solutions on the internet in the cognitive domain are going to improve at an accelerating rate. And I think probably, I don't know the time frame, but at some point it's just going to be seen as irresponsible to leave your child's education up to the local school. And I think in the long run, what you might see is sort of a, just a complete separation of the daycare aspect from education. So kids, I think already we should be here, but we're a little bit behind because of just it's a complex system. But I think kids should, by and large, learn to read and do math on the internet. I think they should learn how to think using the internet. I just think you can do those things way better on computers. It takes a lot of the weight off the teacher, and it's just, I think that's like drudgery. I don't think a lot of teachers really like doing phonics lessons with kids. They like sort of like reading books and kind of inspiring kids to love literature and sharing their passion, and that's maybe something that's best done in person. And so I'd hope that we can get to a world where we move to the internet what can be done uniquely well on the internet, and keep the in-person piece for what can be uniquely done well there. But no idea on the timeline. I mean, it's already happening for people who have the means to do that, and I think it's a matter of time before it gets to the rest of the population. But I wouldn't be able to say how soon that'll happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, as one last quick point for me, I've envisioned a situation where, public school, for example, gives kids basically or gives families sort of if they need it, the infrastructure to learn. So maybe, like you mentioned, childcare, maybe access to computers and Wi-Fi, and then those schools may plug into options like synthesis or other online learning experiences that kids sort of piece together to make their education. Just an idea, a vision kind of I've had.
I think that's right. I think that's happening. And I think also the internet's just, I think you can learn these things more efficiently with computers. And so hopefully that frees up more time in the schools for kids to be kids. I don't think kids should necessarily be sitting in desks, in the, early elementary and like middle school realm for such a long period of time. Maybe it's like 2 to 4 hours a day. Really intense thought work is probably plenty. It's probably plenty enough for adults as well. So maybe kind of try to time box that sort of thing, and then spend more time doing other things, sports or music or whatever kind of hobbies. There's no need to drag out the kind of education or the academic training like we have.
Yeah, there is a better way. We can see, at least I think we're on the cusp of more improvement. So
I think it's actually, things look a bit dark sometimes, but I think I think it could be the beginning of a golden age of education.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I know others maybe have reasonable doubts, but I'm on your side. So for listeners, Chrisman, if they want to learn more about you and your work and your company, where would you like to send listeners?
Oh God! So the company website is synthesis.is, which there's a bunch of materials on there. You can see some videos of kids playing some of the first games, and then I'm on Twitter at Chrisman Frank if people are on Twitter. And there's plenty to dive into there. I've also got a website with some of my essays and threads, chrismanfrank.com.
Yeah, and the essays that I referred to are on chrismanfrank.com. So I suggest listeners go check those out too. Well, until next time, everybody, I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. This is the EdTech Startup Show. And Chrisman, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Gerard.